Let me ask you all a question. I want you to think of the last time you had a conversation with someone you don't know. Might have been this evening when you came to this talk. Now, I want you to cast your mind back and think, how much of that conversation do you remember? Think about it. How much of that conversation did you actually hear? Because I'm willing to bet your conversation went something like this. So the other person talks for a bit, you talk for a bit. They talk for a bit more, you tune out for a bit. You tune back in. You say something, they say something. You tune out a bit more. You're thinking, did I lock the front door? Did I send that email? Then you tune back in and you think, oh, I don't know what she's talking about because I wasn't listening. I'll just nod and smile and she'll never notice and it'll be fine. And I need to tell her that story about the thing that happened to me yesterday because that was so interesting and I can't wait for her to stop talking so I can start talking. Her mouth stops moving, you start talking, and off you go. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. It's because we all do it all the time, every day. And I'm willing to bet you only retained about 30%, 40% of the conversation. It's called social listening, and we do it all the time. And you're comfortable with that, right? Because everybody does it, and we do it all the time. Now I want you to turn the conversation around. How much of what you said do you think they remember? How much of what you said did they actually hear? Now you're all thinking, oh my God, nobody's listening to a word I say ever. And that's what happens, and we do it every day. Now I want you to imagine what would have happened in that conversation if you had really listened. What would you have picked up? What would you have heard? You don't know. You might have heard something that made you go, really? That would have taken the conversation down a completely different path. A path you don't know where that's going to lead. Could have been life-changing. You have no idea. Because you failed to connect with that person, which is, supposedly, what we all want. Now, for a living, I speak and I listen, because I'm a broadcaster, I do it every day. I work in television, I work in radio, I've worked in every kind of program you could name. I have interviewed prime ministers, nurses, rubbish collectors, soldiers, sailors, candlestick makers, poets, bank robbers, murderers. Everybody. People who are just caught up in a news story for just one day, for the first time and last time in their lives. And let me tell you, everybody has a story. No one is boring. Never again think when you just met somebody, oh my God, what a crashing bore. Because they're not. A very famous TED speaker called Brené Brown, who's a social researcher, once said, everybody has a story that can break your heart or bring you to your knees. And she's right. But how do you get to those stories? What's the key? Well, as well as broadcasting for a living, I also teach people to talk, and I teach people to listen. So I teach people who want to appear in the media or who give presentations like this how to speak simply, clearly, from the heart. I also teach journalists who want to be presenters, who want to be talk show hosts. I teach them, they think I'm going to teach them to ask clever questions. What I'm actually teaching them to do is listen. And by teaching, what I found was teaching people to talk taught me more about listening. And teaching people to listen taught me more about talking. And all of those skills in interviews spill over into conversations in everyday life, because a great interview is just a great conversation. And we all have conversations every day. So how do we do it? Well, let's start with listening. So social listening is clearly not going to cut it, right? We've worked that out because nobody's listening. So what we need to do is something called active listening. But what is active listening? Active listening is actually listening. Paying attention. It's that simple. And I learned to teach listening in a very, very unusual way. I was teaching a bunch of journalism students who wanted to be talk show hosts in the Middle East. They're all Arabic speakers, teaching through interpreters, and they're all from different countries. And they're there to learn how to do what I do for a living, how to interview people. So on day one, I pair them up. I make one lot the expert and ask them what they're happy to be interviewed about. The other lot are the interviewers, and then I swap them round. They do the interviews 2 by 2, we play it back, and we critique it. So, of course, what happens is the journalists who are being the interviewer prepare their interviews, write their list of questions, and guess what? When they get in the interview, they stick to their list of questions. They do the interview equivalent of social listening. So while the person is talking, you can see in their eyes they've tuned out because they're thinking about their next question, which means they miss something. The audience doesn't, but they do. And the interview doesn't really work. I can tell them till I'm blue in the face to listen, but they're not listening to me. So I decided to play a bit dirty. So on day 2, I told them, okay, we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to go in and we're going to do these interviews, and you're going to get time to prepare, just the same as yesterday. So I pair them up, tell them what the interviews are about. They prepare their list of questions. We go to the studio. And I rather theatrically say to them, okay, have you got your notes? Yes, we've got our notes. Show me your notes. They show me their notes. Have you got your questions? These are our questions. I then theatrically pick up a waste paper basket, snatch all the pieces of paper, put them in the rubbish bin, and throw it in the corner. And I go, you're interviewing somebody else about something else. You have no time to prepare. Get in the studio. I will shout cue in your earpiece, and off you go. You know that moment when Wile E. Coyote runs off a cliff, realizes he's run out of road, and his eyes come out on stalks? Times that by 10, and those are the faces in the room. So we did the interviews. We go back in the classroom. They all look like they're going to the executioner. They don't want to see it back. And I'm going, I'm not going to show it back to you. I'm not interested in what you asked. I'm interested in how it felt. And the answer I always get back is a version of liberating. And I ask them, what did you do that you didn't do yesterday? And you see the light bulbs go off over their heads. Listen. Why did you listen? We had to. We had no choice, because we didn't know what to ask next unless we listened. And did you enjoy the interviews? Yes, they really enjoyed it. And their skills as interviewers went from there to there in 24 hours. But the most interesting thing was these people who'd never met each other before, from different countries and different cultures, sitting in a classroom, became a group in the space of a couple of hours. They got closer as people in a couple of hours. They connected with each other, and they stayed connected. And at the end of the course, they all said to me, that day changed my life. I was stunned. And they went, it completely changed me, because now I think differently about talking to people. And that's what happens when we truly connect with another person, because we're listening to them, because they know they're being listened to, really listened to. So that's one half of a conversation, because a conversation is a game of 2 halves. So that's the listening. So what about the speaking? Now, what I've noticed when I'm teaching people to speak is that if they feel intimidated, the way many of us do when we speak to a stranger, what happens when you speak to a stranger? We grandstand. We try and be more impressive because we're nervous. It's natural. We don't want to look stupid in front of our peers, so we make ourselves bigger. We use big words, we use highfalutin language, and that language does one thing. It distances us from the person we're trying to talk to. It doesn't bring us closer. It doesn't make us connect. The place I really notice this is when I'm teaching people to give presentations or teaching people to be interviewed in the media. Because what happens then is they run into the mother of all distancing language, the self-replicating algorithm of our time, jargon. We all hate it, don't we? I'm willing to bet at the water cooler in work, you use it yourself. Somebody comes up to you and talks fluent jargon at you. 2 minutes later, you're speaking fluent jargon back. Pointless 4-letter acronyms, PFLAs. It's like a Scrabble bag on acid, and nobody knows what anybody is saying. That is distancing language. We do it all the time. It's an extreme example, but it is the weapons-grade version of distancing language. So for a bit of fun, what I've done with my students is to rewrite a famous speech in public sector jargon to show them just how distancing that language can be. Now, great speakers know that this stuff doesn't work. If you want to connect with somebody, you have to speak from here. You have to speak from the heart, and you have to speak simply. It's not dumbing down, it's speaking simply. But if you're running for jargon, that's not what you're going to do. So here's this speech. You've all heard it. I guarantee you've all heard it. But this time I'm going to do it in public sector speak. And I want you to see if you can guess what it is, and to see how you feel when I say it. So here it is. We commit our partners and stakeholders to a pugilistic solution in area-based initiatives such as coastal regions. We also wish to extend it to areas of agricultural usage, urban pathways, and areas of rural elevation. Capitulation will not be acceptable as an outcome. Anybody feel anything? Are you moved? Motivated? Of course you're not. Didn't understand it. I didn't understand it, and I wrote it. What if I do the original? Because the original was written by a man who knows, or who knew, the power of simple language to connect, heart to heart, mind to mind. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Same speech. How do you feel now? Passionate? Patriotic? Courageous? Moved? If you'd heard the first version at the annual general meeting of Great Britain plc, facing a hostile German takeover, you would have done absolutely nothing. But the second one, you'd really have felt something, even as a member of an audience. Because we don't listen as a collective, we listen as one person. One set of ears to hear the information, one brain to process the information, one heart to respond to the information. We listen as one person. What Churchill knew, he was speaking to one person. He was actually speaking to millions, but he was speaking to one person. And when that poured out of Bakelite radios up and down the land in June 1940 in every scullery in Britain, he knew what effect he was going to have, and everybody remembers it. So I'm going to finish with a story about communicating and speaking with true simplicity that has stayed with me for many, many years. About 20 years ago, when I was a very young reporter, I was sent to Africa to film a bunch of British school children who had raised money for a big international charity, and the money was being spent in Africa. So the children are being sent out, so me and a camera crew rock up in Africa with them, and it's a tough place. This is a tough country. Infant mortality rates off the chart, child-killing malaria, temperature of 45 degrees, female genital mutilation of girls of 8. They marry them when they're 12. Women get married, have babies till they drop dead, aged about 45. There is no clean water available. It's a tough place. They live in huts with grass roofs. The toilet is a communal hut in the middle of the village, which is a pit. You can imagine what that's like in temperatures of 45 to 50 degrees. So these children are there, and I interview them all at the beginning. We film them through 2 weeks as they go around the villages, and I interview them at the end. And at the end, they sit down, we do set-piece interviews one by one, and these are brilliant kids. They are fantastic. They are passionate. They are committed. They do things. They raise money. They're academic, mostly middle class. They're erudite. They are really, really brilliant teenagers. But they know that this footage is going to be seen when they get home by their peers, their teachers, their parents. So what do? They grandstand. Of course they do. We'd all do it. So they try and use big words and big language, and they're trying to be profound, because what they genuinely feel is profound, but the way they express it, and I don't remember a single thing any of them said. But there was one child, the last child we interviewed, who was younger than all the others. He was from a less well-off family, not very erudite, not very academic, really difficult to interview because he didn't have much to say. So he sits down. We set up the interview again. We interview him. It's not much of an interview. He can't say more than a sentence at a time. And I'm thinking, okay, well, it's what we've got. We'll just have to play with this. And then something made me stop. And I thought, Just listen to him. Just don't say anything. Just sit and listen. So I did. Sat in silence, which is not something journalists do very often. And he looked off into the distance at the village we'd been in, at all these children running around, lots of little children, not many taller children, because most of the little ones don't make it past 4. And he sat and he thought. Now, this boy's from Liverpool. He was a Scouser. So if there's anybody from Liverpool in this evening, forgive me for doing the accent, but it sort of lends power to his words. And he looked at me and he said, at home, people complain if they haven't got dishwashers. Out here, they haven't even got dishes. And that's it. He stood up, he'd said his piece, and he walked off. I turned to my cameraman, fresh from a war zone, cameraman as hard as nails, and he looked at me, he went, nailed it. I went, absolutely. He said something true. He said something from the heart, and he said it simply. And it's 20 years on, and I still remember it. I bet you'll remember it too. I don't know what he's doing now. He's a grown-up now. He could be exporting dishwashers to Africa. I don't know. But I'm sure he's doing something amazing. I really hope he is. So I want to close by saying to you, next time you're in that conversation with a stranger, remember, no one is boring. Everyone has a story. And ask yourself why you're in this conversation. Do you want to impress? Or do you want to connect with that person? Be present. Be curious. Pay attention. But most of all, say something true. Listen to something real. And learn something. Thank you.